Hi, I'm Ed Parcaut, your host of Inner Edison. What I'd like you to take away from today's show is our greatest growth comes from our greatest failures. I'll bring you guests that tell their business journey story, and I'll bring you guests on to help you on your journey. Today, we are having somebody who can help you on your journey. His name is Brian Bogert, and he is here with us. And let's find out his story, and we'll go from there. How you doing, Brian?
Dude, I'm fantastic. I'm happy to be doing this with you.
We've known each other for a little while, but we haven't got intimate, I would say, about what each other does and that kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
I met you through the speakeasies with Steve Sims, and it's just the one problem about those events. There's 40 people. I mean, the first few were only 20 something, so it was easier to get to know some people. But I mean, each one, it's hard to get to know everybody. It's just a lot of people, and so I'm glad I'm finally getting to know you, and then my audience gets to know you too. You want to kind of give your background so my audience knows who you are and where you come from?
Yeah. So I'm a husband and father first. I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. I've got a beautiful wife and 2 kids. And I'm an outdoor enthusiast. I love people, and I've got intellectual curiosity. So we'll hit a little bit of my professional background when we get into my story, but that's a little bit about who I am, brother.
I know, but so basically you had something happen to you when you were younger, right?
Yep.
We all have issues that we have from our childhood, and I'm not disregarding what happened to you. I'm just saying we all have something that we have to overcome. And until you do, it affects you your whole life. And most people
100%.
hide it into either their business, or they hide it into this, or, whatever it is, they never deal with it. Until they can deal with it, I don't think they can have the greatest journey they want. So you want to kind of talk about your journey?
100%. So, my journey started with my mom, my brother, and I heading to get a 1-inch paintbrush at Walmart. And as we were headed back to our car, I always had an excitement and vigor for life. So I was, of course, the first one in the car. I wanted to be the one to get home and put that paintbrush to use. My mom and brother were a few feet behind me, and this was back in the days before there was key fobs. So I had to wait for her to literally catch up, put the physical key in the door so we could turn and go on with our day. And as I was standing there, a truck pulls up in front of the store, and driver and middle passenger get out. And the passenger all the way to the right felt the truck moving backwards. So he did what any one of us would do, Ed. He scooted over to put his foot on the brake, but he instead hit the gas. Combination of shock and force threw him up on the steering wheel, up on the dashboard, and before you know it, he's catapulting 40 miles an hour across the parking lot right at us with no time to react. So we're in an end spot. So he goes up and over the median, goes up and over the tree in the median, hits our car, knocks me over, runs over me diagonally, tears my spleen, leaves a tire track scar on my stomach, and continues on to completely sever my left arm from my body.
Wow.
So there I was laying on the ground on a 115-degree day in Phoenix, Arizona. My mom and brother watched the whole thing happen. They look up and they see my arm laying 10 feet away. Fortunately for me, my guardian angel also saw the whole thing happen. There was a nurse that walked out of the store right when this took place, and she saw the literal life and limb scenario in front of her. I'm forever indebted to this woman for her choosing to go into action versus turning on to go on their day, because she came over and stopped the bleeding on the main wound and saved my life, and instructed some innocent standers to run inside, grab a cooler, fill it with ice, and get my arm on ice within minutes so that I could have a fighting chance of having a reattached limb. Had she not done one or both of those things, Ed, I either wouldn't be here with you today, or I'd be here with you today with a cleaned up stump. That's just the reality. So I'm sure your audience wasn't expecting it to go there today. But to your point, right, what I've realized in all this time is I do have a very unique story, but guess what? We all do. We all have unique stories. So what's important is that we pause and become aware of the lessons we can extract from those stories so that we can become intentional with how do we apply them in our lives. And we all have the ability to do that. And we also all have the ability to tap into the collective wisdom of other people's stories to shorten our own curve to learning. So I'll share with you 2 primary lessons that I've used to get me to where I am today. They'll be very quick, and then we can take the conversation wherever we want. The first is I learned not to get stuck by what has happened to me, but instead get moved by what I can do with it. And the second, I didn't realize until far later. See, at 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, although I was having surgeries, although I was the one going through all the therapy, my parents were guiding me through the process, so I was kind of in a fog. They were not in a fog. They were intimately aware of the unceasing medical treatments, years of physical therapy. And the idea of seeing their son grow up without the use of his left arm was a source of great potential suffering for them. So they willed themselves day in and day out to do what was necessary, what was tough, to embrace the pains required to ultimately strengthen and heal me. So whether intentional or not, what they did was ingrain in me a philosophy and a way of living, which is to embrace pain, to avoid suffering. And I believe that when we do this, that's also where we gain freedom. So it's these concepts that we use to not only overcome this unique injury, but how my business partners and I scaled our last business to over 15 million within the span of a decade. And now how I flipped that on its head as a human behavior and performance coach to help individuals and organizations, just like you, just like the people listening, become more aware, more intentional, and who they already are, their most authentic selves. You see, I believe this is when magic happens and the door starts to crack to perspective, motivation, and direction. And that's when joy, freedom, and fulfillment can enter into our lives holistically. And I believe that's why we are on a mission through our entities to impact 1 billion lives by 2045. Because if we can do that, reduce the level of suffering on this planet, allow people to understand their pain through a lens of purpose, move through it so that vulnerability and authenticity, which are the glue that binds human connection, can be in the forefront, then we have the opportunity to all stand our own 2 feet, not just confident, but convicted in who we are, and know that the world's not going to just accept us, but embrace us for who we are. That's what's going to leave this world a better place for my kids and my grandkids.
And the coach came out.
Yeah, there he is.
And I mean that with all due respect, because, you can tell that you have passion about what you're talking about and how you turn that right on. And that's what a lot of people don't understand is we all have something in us that we need to bring out and then see how we can better this world. I always tell my kids, leave it better than you found it, period. And I mean, your injury could be the same as like I deal with the Helping the Brave vets who have other issues and stuff 100%. Like that, and help them through all those things. But I want to talk, what was your last, before we get into, the more performance coach, you brought up your last business that you grew. Yep. What was that? I
was in risk management and employee benefits consulting. So we worked with, it was a B2B type company, right? We were selling the intangible, which was really our consulting. The placement of the insurance was a component of what we did. So it was really a people business more than anything. And it was a fun run. I learned a lot, but it was not my calling. It was not what I was supposed to be doing. And despite the fact that we scaled it and it served all of the purposes and goals that I had sought out to accomplish by chasing the what's in the world, right? What house, what car, what amount of money, what amount of success. I realized about halfway through that I'd actually lost who I was in the process. So when I realigned with that, all of the what's in my world started to become a manifestation of who I was versus the other way around. And that's what now I'm trying to help everybody understand is that, like, really the secret, I believe, lies inside all of us. It's not about the external definition of success or the external narratives. It's about, is our internal voice louder than the voices of the world? And so, yeah, it was a great run. Have no regrets. Had amazing relationships. But after 15 years in that business, 10 with the last one that we scaled, it was time to focus on the impact stage of my life.
Right. And I was, as you're talking, I'm thinking about how all that growth is and what you go through to build that, and how, there's just so much that you have to do. And you were talking about how this is not, first thing came to my head was Talking Heads. This is not my beautiful house. This is not my beautiful wife, because you go through that at a certain age. Mm-hmm. I don't know where you came from, but I came from nothing. Right. Everybody thinks my dad died when I was 12. We moved to the bad side of town. I grew, I joined the Navy, got everything through building myself up in that. And I think, there's just a lot in that we have to get over and grow with. And we all kind of chase things when we're young. And that's what I was trying to get to before I lost my train of thought there. Yeah. But like, I went through that at 28, right? I was living in San Diego in Rancho Santa Fe, coming out of my gated community. Nothing wrong with that, if that's where but nothing I'm just wrong. Saying, no. Yeah, nothing wrong with it. I'm just saying, but for me at the time, I was chasing the wrong thing, and I needed to figure out what I wanted to do and what was important to me for my life. And then that was the series of what I went through personally to find the right place for me and where I need to be. So
yeah,
we all
100%. Yeah, 100%. And I think many people do go through that. Unfortunately, not everybody always gets out on the other side of it, right? They'll get wrapped up in that world. And right, again, the world teaches us to chase the what. The world tells us what we should and shouldn't do. And at the end of the day, what's really important is, like, we do need to calibrate with who we are. We need to understand, what does our definition of success look like? But we've got to move our place to a position of awareness to understand what actually feeds us, what fuels us, and how do we live most authentically? Because that's what freedom is. I mean, that's truly what freedom is when we can get outside of what the world continues to tell us to do and become who we want to become and live the life that we want to have. So yeah, I chased that world. And here's the funny thing. We talk about, like, having to overcome resilience. There have been multiple stages in my life where I had to have different breakthrough moments, because at one point it was 100% mental. There was an intellectual narrative. If I do this, and I'm strong, I'm capable, I can do anything, right? And that worked really well for me until it didn't. When I rebroke my arm, and all of a sudden at 20, I'm sitting there with a rebroken arm in the same place that it came off at because of a snowboarding accident. And all of a sudden I have to understand, like, oh, wow, the world bought into my narrative. The world bought into my narrative because nobody showed up. And it wasn't because they didn't love me. It wasn't because they wasn't there for me. It's because I put out one so strong that I'm good, I'm tough, I'm strong, I don't need anybody's help. And so in the moment that I was one of the most vulnerable places as an adult, I didn't have the courage to ask for help. So I had to shift into this idea of understanding human connection, which is where this idea of vulnerability and authenticity developed. And I did that tactically for a long time. Improved my relationships, improved my connection. But it wasn't until my early 30s, Ed, that I realized that like I had been chasing all these things, but that when I shut off physical pain, also shut off emotional pain. So I overcame the difficulty of what I had done here, but I never really had done the work to understand how that manifested into anger and shame and fear and scarcity and different elements of my life that were actually pulling me back. And so I started to realize, look, what keeps us stuck, right? I think what you were wise enough to recognize, yeah, this isn't alignment with me, but what keeps people stuck is so many people are like looking for the next best thing. They think that they're stuck because the wrong strategy and tactics in their life. Strategy and tactics only get us so far. Like they're important in every business and every way of living, but it is not what keeps us stuck, and it is not what's going to break us free. What I've found definitively is that those people, right, that are stuck or feel stuck, I don't care what category of life they're in, it's a combination of emotional triggers, behavioral patterns, and environmental conditioning. Have they done the work to actually process through whatever pains they've dealt with? Because pain represents itself emotionally, physically, spiritually, mentally, and perceived. And so when we actually pay attention to like, oh, how do we actually overcome the challenges in our lives and move through these things? We have to recognize that we've got a quadrant that we've got to move through, which is mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional. Because for any trauma, any PTSD, anything that's difficult to overcome, we experience it in those 4 quadrants. So I healed myself physically. I got really mentally tough, but what I did was deny what I was doing spiritually and emotionally, which was only a portion of who I was, not my complete self into the world. And human connection without emotion, by the way, isn't human connection. So I'd mastered something tactically, strategically to get human connection. But again, what I'm trying to bring to light is, yeah, you could sit here and say, oh, yeah, this arm, it's a great thing to overcome. But the shit that it actually did to me and how many times it knocked me down in my life because I hadn't dealt with the underlying root pains that weren't physical, right? That stuff was what was going to keep me drowning and circling that drain in perpetual motion.
So how do people come to this realization, or I know how I came to it, but how did you go work through it, and how do you help people work through that?
I absolutely do. Yeah, that's honestly, and the way that we work as a human behavior and performance coach, maximizing business, relationships, health, it doesn't matter. It's, I believe, all rooted in emotional triggers, behavioral patterns, and environmental conditioning. So for me, it was a matter of like really starting to take toll and pay attention to the things that were going on around me. And the first moment that I really leaned in to start to pursue this and understand it was about 6 months after my first kid was born. So this was 7.5, almost 8 years ago. And it was because I always said I was going to do everything for the benefit of my family, but I missed the first 6 months of my kid's life because I was still burning the candle at both ends. I was still chasing all the what's. I was still chasing this like perceived element of success that was all based on material things and making a shitload of money, which I did. Right. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. I do well now, too. I'm not vilifying money. I'm vilifying like what was the intent behind the money. Right. For me, it wasn't in alignment. So I had to take a step back, and I realized that I didn't have the people in my life, nor did I have the smarts or the intellect or the experience to break this pattern that I had developed in my life. And so I hired my first coach, which is frankly what got me into coaching, because a month into working, he goes, Bogert, you got to be doing this. And I said, yeah, whatever. I'm paying you a lot of money not to tell me how great I am, but to help me figure out these other things, like whatever, like F off. Right. Put him over to the side, and he trickled it for 9 months. And what I realized is he was telling me what I needed to hear, not what I wanted to hear, because it was turning into what I'd already done naturally, which was building people and building businesses. And so, and again, with my personal and my professional stories, like, Brian, like, you can do this. The more work I did there, though, the more I realized like it wasn't just about the strategy and tactics, because that's what I was starting to improve, my awareness and my intentionality. So we started to unpack things at a much deeper level. I started to realize I was deeply impacted by shame in a whole variety of ways, but it hid itself because it wasn't necessarily self-worth, which is what most people connect to shame. It was the other side of it. It was when I shut that down and I went to the arena, I was ready to go to battle. It's, who do you think you are? I started to notice that I actually pulled the throttle back in my life because I didn't want other people to feel bad about whatever success I had created. That's how messed up I was, right?
A lot of people are that way, right? I mean,
I had to put in that work.
The biggest, let me just stay right here for 1 second.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't think they're worthy of the success, and so they do stuff to mess that up.
Correct.
Right?
I think that more people are impacted on the worth side than they are on the other side, on the top end. But the fact is, that's the problem with shame, is it's the ultimate wolf in sheep's clothing. It manifests as perfectionism, defensivism, shame, scarcity, worth, control, temper, anger. And all it does is it keeps you confined in this box. You can't live too big. You can't live too small, right? Like the reality of it is that it's generally checking you on both sides. And so that's when I started to move into this area of really understanding, like, what are these triggers? How do we move through them? And that's when I started to create some of the methodology that we now coach based on. And so we have this philosophy, and this is how I've done it. But although I didn't have a structure to guide people through it, until really the last couple of years. But we call it the inside out method. And it really starts with the basic element of awareness, right? We need to be aware that like we either aren't where we want to be, or we aren't reaching our potential, or that we're feeling not good about ourselves in some way, right? So the next step is then how do we become aware of what is the root emotion that's actually keeping us there? So is it fear? Is it scarcity? Is it abandonment issues? Is it shame? Is it like truthfully, like what is the emotion? And we've got to become aware of not only the fact that it has impacted us, but start to become aware of how it's impacted us. Right. So shame impacted me, for example, in my marriage. Right. And it would happen where my wife would say something like, hey, are you going to spend some time with the kids this weekend? Totally innocent question. But I would hear it through my lens of shame, knowing that husband and father is my most important role. And I would hear it through a lens of like, you haven't spent enough time with our kids. So I would react with defensive posturing and rattle off the 10 things I'd just done in the last 4 days to be a good husband and father, when that's not even what she was asking. Right? That was my shame that was impacting me that way. So I had to become aware that, yep, this is where it is. It impacted me in my professions. It impacted me in my relationships. Then I've got to take ownership. Ownership means I need to really understand, like, okay, yes, shame has materially impacted me, and these are the ways how, but I also need to recognize that emotional triggers are designed to be pulled. So I can either allow my emotional triggers to pull me and react and create damage, or I can pull the trigger on my emotional triggers and respond and repair. Right? When I react with defensiveness to my wife, I create damage. It's aggressive. It comes across as angry and defense, and it puts her into a defensive position that perpetuated her elements of triggering. So all of a sudden I have to create the fact that, yeah, I need to own that, yep, shame impacted me, but I created damage in my life as a result of my shame. I made my wife feel unworthy. I spoke down to her. I was defensive, and I added rage into our house in a way that wasn't productive. So I have to own it. And owning is also going to those people that we've created damage with in our lives and actually starting to repair. So most people can get through these first two steps, because these are genuinely intuitive. We know this, right? Awareness and ownership are things that we talk about, we lean into. The next two are where it gets a little difficult. We have to be able to unroot that emotion. Okay? Unroot means we've got to get back to, as a kid, at what point in our life did something trigger us to start this pattern in our lives? Right? So I'm not going to share my own because it's mine to have. But the reality of it is it could be something about a competitive environment created with siblings. It could be you grow up in poverty and your parents are never around. And so you don't know how to give and receive love. It could be scarcity and fear. It could be you have never had money. And so you have scarcity around money and you don't have a healthy relationship with it. Where's that rooted in? Is it in fear and scarcity and guilt? Like, what is it? Right? We need to understand it and unroot it. Where did they start? And did they start to pattern in our lives? Because typically there's more than one root. Once we do that, then we come to the final stage, and this is where it gets really complicated. But it's movement through it. And you're laughing. I'm not trying to overly complicate it.
I'm smiling.
Yeah.
I'm smiling.
Okay, cool.
That's not laugh. That is like, oh my God, I understand. You know, those are
okay. Perfect. I wanted to make sure.
Don't think I'm saying that's not a mechanism for. I'm just like going, yeah, this is amazing. You know,
perfect.
I don't normally.
That was maybe my trigger that reacted right there, Ed.
The problem
I wanted
is
to make sure I'm adding value. So
you are the reason Marcia, my wife, always goes, this is Ed happy. This is Ed sad. So when I add emotion, some people are like, what's wrong with him? Right. So I apologize. So
don't apologize. Don't apologize. Where I was going with that is like, I wanted to make sure, because this is my own shame.
Right.
I don't sell anybody in the personal development world. So when I say it gets complicated, it's not alluding to create a wedge and be like, oh, you need help to do this. I want to be clear on that. So my laughter is like, I want to make sure that I'm not embedding for the purpose of like, oh, come hire us. That's not what I'm saying. So I just want to be clear there. I appreciate
I didn't take it that way. I was like going, everything you're saying, because I look back at what the first thing that popped in my mind when you were talking is I lost my dad at 12, right? So we went poor. So from then forward, my mom was the most scarcity about money. She would not spend a dime, right? So that's the first thing on my pop out of my head. And that's why I was like, oh my God, I totally can see this. The whole thing about losing my dad, it didn't bother me until I had my son. And I was sitting there watching TV and a commercial came on and the son calls dad on Father's Day, which I couldn't do. You follow me? And so as we're going through this, it's popping in my head and I'm like, okay, I can see that. And that's what the whole thing was
Totally. So the movement is the hardest part, because what you just hit is exactly like where it gets challenging in movement as well. Okay. So we get through these things and we've got to understand, how do these emotions move in our body first? So movement is literally, how does it move in our body? So shame. I'll give a couple of examples of mine. I just gave one with my wife and how I could get defensive there. But shame also would trigger me because I'm loud and I talk fast. When I'm in the corporate world in the B2B sales, building and scaling businesses, do you know how many times people would lean over and be like, you can't talk that loud, you can't talk that fast. And immediately I would shrink down into myself. My shame would make me feel unworthy in that moment, like my words didn't matter. I would start biting my tongue. And so with my wife, I would feel kind of rage and defensiveness and chest puffing. But in this case, I actually shrunk down, which shows you, right, it manifests in multiple different ways. What I discovered is that I have about 6 different shame triggers and the way that it moves through my body. Ways that it moves through my body. I have 6 different ways that shame moves through my body. I have over 50 triggers. So what you have to start to do is understand, how does it move through your body first and take toll on that? Because then you can start to pay attention to what puts you into that state. Is it how your wife looks at you? Is it the noise that your kid makes? Is it when you walk in and your business partner gives you a certain look? Like, truthfully, understand like what actually triggers those things, because those are triggers. We have to pair the movement of the emotion in our body to the triggers so that in those moments we can pause and ask ourselves, is this true? Or is this connected to the root that I've already moved through? And so in those moments, we can actually start to create new patterns in our life and break generational cycles like you just described, right? So I've had anger in my life, but again, why I say this is so important. Look, my shame got triggered in just a second ago because I thought you were laughing about something that wasn't even what you were laughing about. Like, no, this was a perfect case in point.
All right,
but that's my point. You weren't even, but that's how I perceived it, right?
I understand.
So my perception triggered something that caused me to react, hopefully not in a way that created damage, because I was like, I see you're laughing, but I was trying to bring it back to repair. But the thing is I completely misinterpreted that based on a trigger. And my point is that's why these are the root. They impact relationships. They impact interactions. They impact how we show up in the workplace. They impact how we work with our customers. They impact how we interact with our wives, husbands, kids, mothers, fathers, siblings. Like, truthfully, these things are the moments of resistance and discomfort that we get triggered in the moment that prevent us from being truly authentic to who we are. So I believe that these triggers and moving through them, that's how I did it with shame. That's how I've done it with anger. This inside out method is what we're teaching. But what does the world teach us? The world teaches us the reverse. It teaches us outside in, right? It says movement is key. So it starts on movement. It says, how do we move? But what that means is shove down the emotions because speed and efficiency are what it is. We can't be affected by these triggers in any moment, not even for a second. So we shove it down. Don't honor the fact that we felt it, right? What we do when we shove it down, because we're moving it down so that we can move forward in the world, is we're actually further rooting in that behavior. We're further rooting it. We're not unrooting it. We're further rooting it. Those roots of that tree are growing deeper into the ground, right? Then again, ownership was the step before that. Guess what? We're no longer in a position of ownership. We're in a position to be a victim. This is what the world teaches. We're going to be a victim if we reverse engineer this. And how can we be aware? No, we're just blinding ourselves to what's actually going on in our lives. So when we're circling the drain around these same things that we've continued to ask ourselves, why do I do this? Why do I do this? If you go through this process, you can start asking yourself, what do I do about it now that I understand the lessons I can extract and how to be intentional in my life? How does this impact my business? And it's these things that genuinely free people holistically in their lives.
And I can totally see that. Right. I totally see how all that works. And because I mean, just when you were talking, how it affected me mentally, pictures of what's going on in my life.
Yeah.
So, and that's why one of the things that I found through doing Inner Edison Podcast and all the people I spoke to, the most important thing that you can do is have a coach, a mentor, a corner man, whoever it is, to help you go through multiple, and it can be totally multiple different coaches, one for your business, one for you personally, one for this, one for exercising, one's for food, you name it, because we need that help. Myself,
I have coaches in every category, by the way, that you just mentioned. Genuinely, I even have a spirituality and consciousness coach. I mean, truthfully, right? Like in many areas where I don't have a skill set, I hire somebody to help me.
Right. Yeah. And for me, I mean, I know how to work out. What I didn't know how to do is eat the right portions of certain things. So I just finally picked up a coach for that, and that's helped me in the past. I don't know, 5 weeks, drop 20 pounds. So, and that's not even like starving, you know what I mean? Because I used to do all those different diets, Whole30, all this stuff, and drop 30 some pounds, but then I would pick it right back up because you pick up the thing, where now it's like, I just needed somebody to tell me what's the max I need of this, and this. So I knew exactly to keep it there because I know how to do everything else on that part. So,
yeah, but that's the truth. Like I'm a believer that we all should find coaches, mentors. And when I say coach or mentor, that doesn't necessarily mean a paid coach either. I want to be really clear on that. I think that there's a lot of people who aren't ready for coaching at a high level, but are in different areas of their life. So even spouses, kids, parents, general therapy and counseling can start to bring awareness into things in your life so that you can start to move through them. But the one thing is, just don't go it alone. We can't. And we're going to be too blind to the areas that we need to improve if we don't have perspective in our lives.
And one of the ask for help.
Ask for help.
Yeah. I mean, that I run into that all the time in the veteran world, where we are so quick to fix everything for everybody else, but we never ask for help for ourselves. So it makes it harder for us as veterans to ask for help, which is so stupid. Because that's just who we are when we go through the military. And that's how a lot of people,
I'm still working on, though. I mean, truthfully, myself, I struggle with that.
Yeah. Because we all think we should be able to handle everything. And reality is, it's okay not to know how to do everything. That's why you have people, so they can help you get there faster or help you get through something. I mean, that's why I have the coaches I have now. And, and I do this so I can meet other people so that I can get more information and find certain things out, because I'd be amazed how many people I talk to on here that changes my life. And that's,
sure,
just because there's, it's amazing what people have to share. And it doesn't matter if it's a Steve Sims or Greg Reed or whoever these other names. It's not that. I get the same amount of exactly. Everybody has a story that needs to be told, and and their journey along the way. And that's why I do the Inner Edison podcast.
Well, I mean, that's what I said in the beginning too. Like, we all have the ability to tap into the collective wisdom of everybody else's experiences. If we put ourselves in a position to ask the right questions, meet the right people. Right. There's that old adage, that old saying. I wish I could accredit it to who said it, but it's the statement that the only difference between who you are today and who you'll be 5 years from now is in the books that you read and the people that you meet. Right. Like, reality is, it's not actual books. It's like, what are you consuming? Right. Are you watching YouTube? Are you watching, like, where are you getting your information? Is it helping you? Is it fundamentally helping? Again, the people piece, all that is like, what are you funneling yourself into from a perspective element in your life? Because perspective points us at what's important if we're paying attention. And so seek perspective. You starting this is to have interesting conversations. Most podcasters started it out of selfish needs, to be honest. They're like, I just wanted to have interesting conversations with people. And it happened to be that when I got interesting conversations with people, that other people wanted to listen as well. That's what you're doing. And you're doing it on steroids in a way that's really cool.
Yeah. I just enjoy, that's what I like doing, talking to people, get to know their story. It's about them, not me. And that's what's important, because I want to know your story. I mean, they can find out my story from the first episode, why I'm doing this. And it's just to meet people, understand their journey, because everybody needs to understand that we all make mistakes. Our greatest accomplishments come from our greatest failures. And it's okay to tell people. And a lot of us hide that. We were just talking about how we hide with shame and everything. We hide that. Don't hide that. Fail a lot. That's okay to fail, because then you've figured out a way not to do something. What's that phrase? I never lose. If I don't win, I'm learning. Right. I think that was Nelson Mandela or whatever said that. I was like, man, I wish
most people are afraid to fail, right?
Yeah. It's like, well, I come from and I brought this thing all the time. Military background, medical. You fail, someone dies. Right. So it's ground. So you come from that world. You don't want you don't want to fail on anything. Right. And that was my reason. So besides having the great conversation, Steve pushed me to do this because of my fact that I don't like to fail. I mean, I'll do everything I can and work on stuff for very long so that it doesn't happen. And if I do fail in my business I expect my staff to, but not me. I can't. And now it's like, man, I finally, so it's cathartic for me, even though I get to meet all these people and understand their story. It helps me understand that, hey, it's okay to do what we just did. I ran through the same thing. That's why I shared about my dad, shared about my mom. I have no problem sharing my story anymore, where before I wouldn't.
Right. Well, and the thing is again, I think we need to understand that fear and failure both give us feedback if we're listening, and hone our focus if we're paying attention. Now, fear gives us one other thing that we need to pay attention to, is that it's often fabricated. So we need to pay attention to that, because fear is often what we're afraid to fail. So we need to understand fear so we can move through failure, but let's understand failure too. So fear, I often say that all the greatest things in life are on the other side of fear: fun, freedom, and fulfillment. But if we look at fear as understanding that it's not about shutting it off, it's about understanding it and being intentional on how to move through it, then we can start to apply the same concepts to failure. Right. So I've been mountain biking with my son for a few years. And this is like where an analogy that I think helps people understand this concept. So if we pay attention to fear, like, he wanted to go mountain biking, but I made him earn his bike. And I made him understand all the mechanics of getting on the bike, how he's transferring his weight, brake modulation, shifting gears, like literally standing, sitting, He needed to be able to rock the bike. Like I needed to make sure that he could go actually out on the mountain and do it. And we had some basic rules. Like when we go out there, unless you're catastrophically broken, like you will walk your bike back or ride your bike back. And if we climb a hill, we will ride down it. If we need to walk up a hill, we can, but if we need to, we're always going to ride down. And these were just rules. I was like, bro, like we're going to do this because my son, he's on the spectrum. He gets anxiety and fear takes over if he doesn't pay attention to it. So these are concepts I used with him. When his anxiety surpassed his ability to cope and fear would kick in, we would have to walk back and pare this back. So we start doing these things. We prepare him. We learn all these things, but we get out to the mountain. He's ready. He climbs up the hill. First time he gets up to the hill and he's ready to go down, guess what? Completely frozen with fear. What's he afraid of? He's afraid to fail. He's afraid to fall. He's afraid to get scraped. And where he is actually putting himself is into a position to not be able to perform. So we just pause and we slow down. We stop at the top. We pay attention to, okay, what's the best line to pick? Like we understand like this is probably the best place. So we're going to pick our line first. Then we're going to anticipate failure points, right? Are there soft spots with sand at the bottom? Are there rocks somewhere? Is there catastrophic failure? Is there cliff on one side? So that if we know we're going to fail, we fall this way, right? We need to make sure that we understand, like plan ahead. What are potential failure points and what are we going to do when we get to those moments? How do we respond? If we can go through that type of a process and we can anticipate it, we can then rehearse that path. And then at some point, you just got to let go of the brakes and let it roll. Right? In mountain biking, when you cramp down on the brakes, when you're going downhill, you could literally flip over your bike. So we think brakes are going to save us. And that's the same thing as entrepreneurs. We think that slowing down and cramping on the brakes, if we hold back, that's what's going to get us there. But the reality of it is we got to let it roll. But again, if we go through that type of a process, we can start to understand we are going to fail. Right? But those failure points, if you slip out and you slide out at the bottom of that mountain one time, you're probably not going to do it again. If you fail on the same thing multiple times, it becomes a pattern. And that is where growth doesn't happen. But if you can look at every failure, not as, okay, is this an incremental failure or a monumental failure? Do I have a massive goal to produce X amount of impact and I'm going to fail along the way to get there? Or am I failing at that massive goal? If I have incremental failures along the way, each one of those refines my path so that outcome will actually probably be better if I put in the work. All the most successful people I know have failed more times than they've ever succeeded. But the problem is most people don't understand that failure is your greatest teacher. It gives us feedback and hones our focus if we're paying attention.
Yeah, I was listening to someone's Audible book the other day and talked about Michael Jordan, how he says how many times he failed and cost the championships, and he has a number so that he knows what he did wrong and how he can fix that and move forward. And it's the same thing what you just talked about. I mean, I totally understand that with the mountain biking because I like the mountain bike. Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, you apply that concept in life and it's the same thing, right? We pick our path, we anticipate failure, what are critical failures and avoid them. And at some point we got to move into faith and let go of the brakes and let it roll. Like that's the concept. That's how you can move through fear and understand that failure is a gift.
Drop the mic. I mean, I want to leave it right there because that's everything we talked about. I want, shame. And then the most important thing at the end, fear is what causes most people not to move forward, just like you said, or not make a decision because they're afraid to make the wrong decision. You just have to make a decision, whether it's right or wrong, and move forward with whatever that outcome is. Right. And then learn from it and then make it again and learn from that one. So
that's exactly right, my friend. Well said.
Brian, I appreciate you being on today.
Man, it was a pleasure. Thanks for creating a platform and pushing past your fears so that we could pour some good into the world together.
I appreciate you being on here. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today on Inner Edison. I hope you enjoyed today's episode and what our guest, Brian Bogert, brought to the table with us. And I appreciate you being on here again. And if you want to get to know him, you can find him online at Bogert.com and check him out. And again, Brian, thanks for being here.
Thank you, brother.